Hey there team, let's get this intro out of the way. World of Warcraft, it's a game, it's got dungeons, and it's got a new expansion, Shadowlands, which means new dungeons to dive into. I've been mainly doing instances these past few weeks, and I got a pretty reasonable tier list going for them. So this video, I will be rating all 8 dungeons introduced in Shadowlands from worst to best. Friendly reminder that this list is all personal opinion, it's all subjective. So take it how you will. Alrighty, with that, here we go. Number 8, Plaguefall. There is a lot to hate about Plaguefall, but the long and short is that Plaguefall has 3 major marks going against it. 1, this dungeon is loaded with group-wide dots and damage, and as a single target healer, having to constantly heal the group sucks. 2, DPS need to do things. The DPS need to kill adds and dodge attacks, break enemies out of stealth, avoid slams and tentacles, and honestly, DPS are dumb as hell, and having to rely on the DPS to be smart is just too hopeful. Most of this dungeon is a nightmare since there are people constantly messing up mechanics. And 3, the story of this dungeon is really boring. Who cares about any of these characters or whatever, and the story the dungeon is trying to tell is nothing. The bosses come down to killing adds and avoiding obvious damage, which are 2 things Pug DPS hate doing. And nothing about these fights are exciting or interesting, they're really kinda just tank and spanks. And really, only the last boss has anything remotely engaging. But she also does group-wide stacking dots at one point, so for me, there just is nothing in this dungeon that makes me want to run it. At some point, this dungeon even had skips, but Blizzard has since patched those out. Plaguefall is truly the only dungeon where I actively have no fun running it. Number 7, Halls of Atonement. Halls of Atonement is probably the most forgettable instance for me, personally. The bosses are all easy and don't really provide any challenge. The only real challenge this dungeon offers is the stacking bleed debuff that the bear trash applies to the tank. If your group is smart enough to kite or stun the bears, then they're not really an issue. Besides them, the trash is kinda whatever, and I think the beginning anima feeding is boring, it's dull. There's nothing in this dungeon that is really bad, but there's also nothing that's really good in it either. The saving grace of Halls is that it's on the shorter side of dungeons if you ignore the opening trash. There just isn't a lot to say about the instance, which is primarily why it's down here. It's just a short, forgettable experience with nothing exciting going on. I guess we can take this time to mention that I am a holy paladin, so this video is coming from a healer's perspective, and that might affect some of the choices on this list. Alright, let's move on. Number 6, Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake is an alright dungeon. Honestly, it's just the beginning that worries me, then everything else is fine. People try to get cute with the first boss and skip trash, which leads to people pulling trash during the boss fight. And if the worms aren't killed before exploding, then the group basically wipes. It's group-wide AoE damage that happens, so, you know, I'm not a fan. Then the following hallway is full of trash that puts healing absorb debuffs on players, and that casts spells that need to be interrupted, so if you got reasonably smart DPS and a tank that doesn't pull multiple groups at once, it's easy peasy. After the first boss in that beginning hallway, the dungeon's really short, and the bosses are all easy. I think the meat hook gimmick from the third boss is pretty fun, and I personally like the battlefield background, angels versus skeleton monsters. I like that you also fly up into a necropolis and fight atop a mini Naxxramas, that's cool. I just personally wish the bosses were better. Except for the meat hook one, that one's alright. For the most part, this is kinda like a whatever dungeon. A theme of this video is that Plaguefall is really the only dungeon I think isn't fun, and the rest of the dungeons are either good or Sadly, Necrotic Wake and Halls of Atonement fall into this category. Number 5. Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension is a long dungeon. It definitely feels like the longest one anyways. This is a pretty average dungeon overall though, as I consider it to be on the easier side of things. What I think really detracts from Spires is the flying between platforms. So if you don't know, in Spires of Ascension, you fight along these platforms in the clouds, and to move from platform to platform, you have to talk to an angel who flies you over. And there's kind of a twofold problem with this that negatively affects players. One is that you don't have any control over your character while you're flying from platform to platform. And two, the actual flying is pretty slow. So if you're racing against the clock in a Mythic Keystone, slowly sailing through the air while not actively participating can be a real drag at times. The trash deals a lot of AoE damage, but the bosses are pretty easy to handle, so the difficulty overall isn't that exciting. I like the first and last boss a lot, actually. I think the Forsworn bosses have fun movement mechanics, and the spear throwing at the end is cool too. Like I said, it's a long dungeon, but what makes up for the length of Spires, in my opinion, is the war backdrop. Granted, I wish the battle felt more intense instead of the party just cleaving through a bunch of stagnant Forsworn, but the idea is cool enough for me. Not a lot of the dungeons really feel like there's active stuff going on, and Spires of Ascension does a good job of placing you in the middle of a battle. However, it only takes the number 5 spot on the list. It's just an average dungeon overall, honestly. Number 4. Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths was going to get a top 3 spot because of how short it is, and how visually obvious almost every mechanic in the dungeon is. But as I've continued to grind Mythic Pluses, it's fallen down a spot. I like that there are a lot of mechanics in this dungeon, I like that the bosses require a lot of movement, and I like the idea that you're doing a prison break. The idea behind Sanguine Depths is that you're here to rescue a Naru, and then once you've acquired them, you gain a special ability which is required to progress through the remainder of the instance. And I think the addition of a dungeon-specific mechanic that isn't like a vehicle is really cool. Overall, this is just a fun, short dungeon, and I like that I can take the Naru and not rely on any other party member for it. If it isn't painfully clear, I don't trust the random clowns I run dungeons with. Sanguine Depths just doesn't have downsides. It's short, it has a lot of mechanics, and those mechanics aren't hard to deal with. It is overall a good time. Number 3. Mists of Terna Scythe. I actually hated Mists of Terna Scythe the first time I ran it. But after I learned how to get through the Lost Woods, I started loving the place. So despite being the most uniquely designed dungeon out of the 8, Mists only has 3 bosses, and while the trash can get tiring at points, the bosses are actually fun. I like that the first boss is related to fighting the trash before it, you gotta beat up the tree guys to free them, and then that lets you attack the real boss. I'm a big fan of the similarities there. It's cool that the forest puzzle plays a role in the Mistweaver fight, figuring out which icon doesn't match the others. I like that idea a lot too. Plus that fight has some fun mechanics like dodgeball and freeze tag, which adds to the stuff that's going on. I think that the last boss isn't particularly difficult or does anything special, but overall it's a fun dungeon. I do like the theme. I like the idea of going through a forest that is slowly deteriorating and being consumed. And I like the incorporation of the Lost Woods. That idea, the idea that if you go through the wrong door, you get sent back to the beginning. It is annoying when you get it wrong, I'll give you that, but it's an idea that's unique to World of Warcraft. I like fresh ideas, I like them incorporated in cool ways, so I like Mists. I don't know if it's just me, but I really enjoy Mists of Terna Scythe, but I can see how other folks might find it annoying. Overall though, I think this is just an enjoyable dungeon to do. Number 2. Theater of Pain. Ooh, Theater of Pain! The Thunderdome! The Theater of Pain is dope as f***. One, it's in Maldraxxus, and Maldraxxus is metal to the core. 2, the idea of having a dungeon in a coliseum, while not entirely new, is such a sweet idea. 3, the way Theater of Pain utilizes its space is very efficient. I like how all 3 of the wings are unique, containing their own style of enemies and mechanics, which correspond to the bosses of each wing. 4, I like that there's not a lot of trash. Could be considered minimal, even. And 5, the bosses are fun with their own memorable mechanics, including the last boss, which will kick the crap out of anybody who isn't prepared for it. The meat hook dodging, the tornadoes swerving, the spirit reclaiming, the 1v1ing in arena. It's just cool. It's cool and it's memorable, and I think they took this basic idea of fighting in a coliseum and really added so much more to it. And just the concepts that are being thrown around in the dungeon are so different from any other dungeon in the game. It really is this own unique experience, and it's just a lot of fun. I think it's sweet. Just a really cool dungeon. All of it just leads to Theater of Pain being f***ing badass. Number 1. The Other Side. I was, and still am, surprised that this might be a controversial pick for Best Shadowlands Dungeon. I'm gonna be honest. I get why other people might not like The Other Side, but I personally think that its strengths vastly outweigh its weaknesses. So let's just get into it. Pros of The Other Side are that it's a fairly straightforward dungeon. There are 3 wings you need to go through, and each wing is unique with special trash and scenery. The bosses at the end of each wing are pretty different from other bosses in Shadowlands. You got trampoline jumping, laser dodging, bomb defusing, power siphoning, and ad killing. Whatever. Okay, maybe that's not so different. You also get to visit some different locations, since The Other Side teleports you to different places on Azeroth. I really like that the trash in this instance is meaningful. Like, the Hakar trash has whirlwinds to dodge and ghosts to avoid, and the Millhouse Manastorm trash has line of sighting and explosion dodging and Frogger. The Ardenwald animal trash has the unique jumping curse, where you have to jump to avoid it stacking up. And the birds have a debuff of stacking, where the more birds there are, the more damage the tank ends up taking. That's not to mention the circle trash, the trash in the big main area, which has big mobs that cause these huge effects like giant knockbacks and massive whirlwinds and huge explosions. You know, this dungeon, when played at, the appropriate levels of gear, always keeps you on your toes, and I personally enjoy that. I don't like killing pointless trash that doesn't do anything special. I find that boring. Lastly, though, is the final boss, Monzala. And this fight it's beautiful. It is, without a doubt, the hardest fight that any of the Shadowlands dungeons have to offer. You got bombs that you gotta drop, laser beams you gotta dodge, and this move, Shattered Reality, requires coordination to split up the group to go off through portals to then kill, the reflections of the boss in order to unlock Bloodlust. I think the fight's really cool. The stuff it has is easy to dodge and whatever if you just pay attention, but literally every mechanic in WoW is easy if you just pay attention. Anyways, the downsides to The Other Side are the Hakar wing definitely looks and feels incomplete. It doesn't feel like you're in Zul'Gurub, it just feels like you're in a hallway. The trash in Ardenwald, or wherever the broker boss is supposed to be, can be really annoying. The birds in particular are very irritating with how much they move around and how many can aggro at once. And just having Ardenwald be an area in the dungeon is kind of lame, since it had the potential to be anywhere and it just so happens to be right outside the dungeon. I guess another pro while thinking about it is I really like Blansamdi, and I like him talking throughout the dungeon. I think it's fun. I mean, I love the trolls and the troll loas and the lore and all of that stuff. So to me, it's cool. Actually, really looking back on this list, it makes a lot of sense that I'd put the troll dungeon at number 1. For some folks, though, they might not be as into the final boss fight as much as I am, and they might think the dungeon is a little too boring. But for me, I think the dungeon with some of the least amount of trash, and that the trash that it does have is some of the best. You got the dungeon with the coolest mechanics for both trash and boss fights, and the dungeon with the best boss fight so far earns the #1 spot on my list for best Shadowlands dungeon. And that's the list. These are just my thoughts and opinions, and again, this was from a healer's perspective, even more specifically a single target healer's perspective, so keep that in mind. I hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free to let me know what you thought of the list, what you think of the dungeons in Shadowlands overall, if there is a dungeon you like, or a boss fight you hate, or anything like that. I'd love to hear it. You know, because the only opinions I ever hear from my friends are Mist sucks and Theater of Pain is the only good one. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, and take it easy.
Oh, did my cat just block that for me?
Wow.
Then we should go back to the other side and res him. Then I'm talking about go back to the other side of the flies and res him. Make him do it again. Until he can successfully do it.